Let's get started. Welcome to Core Conversations, a project of ACTC. First, let me sort of walk you through the kind of rules of the road for our conversation for the next hour or so. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option that says Participants. If you open that up, you'll see at the bottom of the pop-up window an option for Raise Hand. That's what you should do if you would like to make a comment or ask Professor Montás a question. Turns out the software makes it easy for me, and those hands go up in the order that you raise them. So I will, for the most part, follow the order. If there's somebody who hasn't raised their hand yet and others who have, I might let the new voice skip up the queue a little bit, but for the most part, I'll recognize you in the order that you raised your hand. The idea is that we have a lively conversation, so I'll sort of ask everyone to, if you have 2 or 3 questions to ask one, and then get back on the queue and try to limit your remarks to maybe 3 minutes or so max, and that'll keep the conversation lively. When you are not asking a question, please keep yourself muted. That'll avoid feedback and other kind of distractions to the conversation. Please feel free to have your camera on or off while you're listening to the conversation. But do, if you are asking a question, please do turn your camera on so we can see you when you do that. First, I'll introduce our core conversation scholar, Professor Roosevelt Montás, in just a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about ACTC. For some of you, this might all be old news, but for others, either live or watching this as a recording, you may be new to ACTC, and I want you guys to know what we're about. The mission of ACTC, we say we are an international professional liberal arts organization dedicated to fostering the use of core texts, world classics, and other texts of major cultural significance in undergraduate education, and also the development of required or widely taken core programs steeped in such texts. We were organized in 1985. We brought, colleges came together that promoted integrated and common study of world classics and other texts of major cultural significance. And I would say that ACTC has very much succeeded in those original goals. The ACTC conference every year is a time I look forward to very much, where I get to meet with people from all over the world now because ACTC has expanded its mission globally, in Asia and Europe particularly, and to people who have these shared interests in core texts. But ACTC has 2 divisions. One is the conference division, and the other is the Liberal Arts Institute division. And in that division, ACTC conducts special projects on programmatic, curricular, pedagogical, and research issues involving the liberal arts and core texts. So lots of good work on that side too. This program that you've tuned into today is Core Conversations. It's a new initiative by ACTC designed to keep us connected and in conversation during the pandemic. So I guess it's sort of an offshoot of the conference division, since we can't meet together right now as a conference. We'll sponsor roughly 1 core conversation a month this academic year, and each will have a recorded element like this one did that you can watch at your leisure, and also a live Q&A, just like the one we're about to have. Each core conversation this year will be led by a member of the ACTC board, and will be grounded in a core text of their choosing. There is no theme, just a smorgasbord of thoughtful scholars discussing all kinds of texts from the ancient and contemporary world, from the Eastern and Western traditions, texts that they think are important, texts that they love. Our next core conversation, after, not this one today, I'll introduce Professor Montás in just a second, but our next core conversation will be led by Joshua Perrins, who is the Dean of the Braniff Graduate School at the University of Dallas and Chairman of the Board of Directors of ACTC. ACTC. His recorded remarks on Averroes' commentary on Plato's Republic are already available on the ACTC webpage. And his live Q&A will be 10 a.m. Eastern Time, Friday morning, October 16th. So the same time, Friday morning at 10 Eastern Time, but October 16th. This table always has seats available for everyone. So we hope you'll join us for as many of these core conversations as you can. And you'll invite your colleagues, students, and friends to join us as well. But now it is my real pleasure, my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our core conversation scholar today, Professor Roosevelt Montás. Professor Montás is a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University. He specializes in antebellum American literature and culture, with a particular interest in American citizenship. He was the director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia College for 10 years. Just stepped down from that position about a year ago. He's a seminar instructor for the Freedom and Citizenship Program, sponsored by the Center of American Studies. And he speaks and writes on the history, meaning, and future of liberal education, and is working on a book with Princeton University Press on these topics. So, Professor Montás, welcome, thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for taking the time to tune into this conversation. We can jump right into questions or comments. I hope that you've all had a chance to see the frame.
Professor Montás has had a little bit of a few technical issues this morning, but so far they've resolved themselves quickly. So if you'll just be patient, hopefully you'll catch right up.
Remarks that Charlie. Okay, am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay.
But we didn't hear anything you said. You froze before you said anything. Other than thanking me, which was, of course.
I hope that improves. I was on the phone frantically this morning with Spectrum, my cable provider. So we'll see. I apologize. This is, I guess, part of our new reality, our absolute helplessness and dependence on wires and cables. I hope you had a chance to read the remarkable speech on the 4th of July, on the meaning on the 4th of July to the slave. We can jump right into questions. I could also read to you. I assigned this text to open this semester in one of my classes, and got a set of responses from students that were very moving and I think penetrating. One of them in particular stuck out to me, and in fact, just to throw out themes, I'm just going to go ahead and read. It's kind of a one-page response, and then I'm just going to open up the floor for questions or comments from you. So this student, who I will not name for confidentiality, and I guess I want to begin by reading this simply because this text is a great teachable text. That is, this is a text that speaks very powerfully to students and to which students react very well. So it's a text that works well in the classroom, and not all core texts work well in the classroom. Not all core texts, that is texts of major significance that deserve a student's attention, work well in a teaching context. This one does. So this student wrote, "When I was reading this, I was in a constant state of awe. In every line I read, I felt the full force of Douglas's brilliant intellect and oration powers. My reading experience reminded me of a time when I watched a master Chinese calligrapher write lines of calligraphy across a giant piece of paper. Each brush stroke was deliberate, clean, fluid, and expressed his intentions to the greatest extent. Douglas is a master of words and structure. He structures his speech so that it begins with an extensive history lesson on the founding fathers' fight for freedom and justice, which has the effect of making the audience at ease and having them rejoice in their values of independence and liberty. Then Douglas jumps to the present and sharply points out that he and his fellow people are excluded from this freedom and justice, and begins to attack the grotesque hypocrisy that exists in America. This way of structuring is really amazing and effective because by reminding the audience of America's founding values and drawing parallels between the colonies' struggles for freedom and the slave struggle to gain freedom, Douglas makes it hard for the audience not to support the anti-slavery movement and view it as a justified revolt against the oppressor. Throughout his speech, Douglas ingeniously backs his audience into tight corners where for them to continue feeling that they are upholding the glorious values of freedom and America, they have to forcefully denounce slavery. Douglas achieves this by aligning himself with the right side of history, with religion, and with basic American values. While I am no stranger to America's gross hypocrisy and violent injustice, reading Douglas's account of them still packs a punch. As someone who, along with her family, came to America for a better life because we believed America to be the land of opportunity and freedom, it is always jarring to come face to face with America's bloody and ugly past, which also extends into the present. The idea of America that my family worshipped and sought after is so different from what it actually was and is. A big part of growing up was learning to think critically about US history and rejecting the simple and glorified versions of history that were force-fed to me in school and in the media. However, what makes it devastating is that almost 200 years later, Douglas's speech is still so relevant today, and America's shameless hypocrisy is still around. It really feels like he was writing a speech for July 4th, 2020. Really a remarkable response, captures so many of the essential themes here that Douglas invokes. Donald Trump, yesterday or so, began to complain about the dominance of what he takes to be an anti-American agenda in the teaching of American literature and history and politics, and has now set out to hunt down this witch and purify the teaching to make it more patriotic. So it kind of, again, just highlights the relevance of a text like this. One of the things I admire about Douglas is his ability to not fall into either blind condemnation or blind worship, but really strike a balance of upholding the ideals that the best ideals that the revolution stood for, while condemning full-throatedly its failures to live up to those ideals. Anyway, I'd love to open to the floor for discussion, and I think Charlie has agreed to moderate.
Yes, that's right. The queue is open, and Matt, you are up first. Please, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Awesome, thank you. So I actually really enjoyed his speech, and I also noticed that in his speech, he explicitly makes clear his reverence for the founding fathers, and how even though he detests this practice of slavery, he can't help but be impressed and admire what the founding fathers achieved in their brilliance, in their patriotism, and their dedication to freedom. And so I just wanted to ask, why does that seem so completely absent in the current discussion on, racial justice with BLM? And we're seeing quite, in fact, the opposite, where we've seen this whole summer statues being taken down, names being removed from schools, and almost this racial puritanism that seems to override any historical significance of what the founding fathers have done in laying the foundation of this country.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is, in this response that I read from the student, both things are there. That is, both her reflection that what she was taught in school was just the triumphalist version, and what you have in the force of BLM and in the current impulse to condemn American hypocrisy is an impulse to correct a history of teaching about American history that has been triumphalist and dominated by simply worshiping and glorifying the founding fathers. So the impulse is a corrective impulse, a revisionist impulse, an impulse that says that which we were taught and exposed to in school is not the full story. In fact, the full story is why. As it often happens, and it not just on this issue of kind of a racial accounting, but in all kinds of activism that tries to reframe the paradigm, some of the most outspoken voices there go to the other side of the ditch. That is, make the mirror mistake of, which again is something I admire Douglas doesn't do, but make the mirror mistake of completely erasing the value, the significance, the admirable qualities of founding fathers and the ideals and what they fought for, completely erasing that or subsuming that, denying that, and simply saying, well, the project, the American project, was always simply a project to oppress and entrench slavery and secure the government's enforcement of slavery. So I guess that the short answer, at least what I think, is that there is a corrective effort being undertaken that because it's trying to correct a triumphalist narrative, often does the opposite and makes a similar mistake in offering a merely condemnatory narrative. What is our responsibility in that? What is our job in that? And I think academia doesn't do this well. Academics will often be zealots in one ideology or the other. And I think our job as people who are in some sense committed to the truth, in some sense committed to a non-ideological evaluation of the best evidence in front of us. Our job is to complicate those narratives on both ends. That is, our job is to say the triumphalist narrative that is common and which is the only thing that many people see and the only thing that many people have seen for most, that has dominated American teaching of American history, that is incomplete. That is incomplete, and incomplete in such a way as to reinforce a certain kind of harm. On the other hand, seeing that and correcting that does not mean that we ignore the contributions and the values that underlie the American project. And look, this is a really old debate. That is, there is an old debate about what is America really about. And there would be people that say, well, America is really about a white supremacist country whose capitalist organization requires a kind of diversity, a kind of free market, but which the dominant racial ideology is always trying to suppress. And that's what America is. And there's another version that says, no, America is simply the land of the free and simply a project committed to equality. And these two visions of America are from the beginning struggling, and from the beginning looking to establish one master narrative. And Douglas was right in the middle of that debate. And one way that I've come to think about Douglas is as a principled pragmatist. And there aren't that many of those. In fact, for most people, to be a pragmatist means to give up principle. And Douglas is a principled pragmatist, somebody who navigated an incredibly complex and polarized political environment, and which very often had to accept certain compromises that were not in keeping with his values, yet always was unambiguous about what he was fighting for. One example of this is his own purchase of his freedom. When Douglass was in England, friends of his got together, raised money to purchase his freedom, which meant that he had to open a correspondence with his owner, his legal American owner, and give him some money. And many of Douglass's abolitionist colleagues were radically opposed to this idea, because to participate in, to buy a slave, which is what Douglass did, to participate in the economic system that legitimized and accepted the legal status of ownership, was to grant the basic point. And Douglass says, look, I get it. I agree with you. On the other hand, I'm a fugitive man. The US government is after me. So he makes this pragmatic compromise. Similarly, when he supported the 13th Amendment, when he supported the amendments giving black men the vote, he had to break, I think it's the 15th Amendment, he had to break with the suffragists, the women's rights advocates that had collaborated with him for a whole career, because they wanted the universal voting. And that was not going to happen in Congress. However, a vote for the black man was a possibility. And Douglass throws his weight behind, okay, let's get the vote for the black male now and postpone the fight for universal suffrage until a later date. Again, a pragmatic compromise that caused him to break with former allies. Anyway, a principled pragmatist. And I think that we can take a lesson from that as academics in how we deal with these competing narratives of what America is about.
Not surprisingly, the queue has grown a bit. Thomas Cleveland, you're next. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you. I thought, this is along the same lines, the same theme, but I thought we might look at it in terms of the text. So there's, unfortunately, we're not using the same, or I don't think I'm using the same document, but we have, he says about the founding fathers, they love their country better than their own private interests. And though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. I was interested in that phrase, it's not the highest form of human excellence. And I thought maybe there's a way, just even in terms of this text, we could reconstruct, or I'm asking you if you think there's a way we can reconstruct what he thinks the highest form of human excellence is. Maybe this is a clue. It requires, a form of human excellence lacking what he talks about here would be incomplete as well, something like that. People unwilling to die for love of their country, give up their private interest. It's probably also a defect if you're unable to respect someone that acts in such a way. But how do we articulate the other part that's missing from this form of human excellence?
Thomas, it's good to see you. I missed, I had one of those freezes and I missed, I think, a part of your question. I'm sorry. So I wonder if you can just repeat again the aspect of human excellence that would be missing.
So we have the highest, it's not the highest form of human excellence to give up your private interest for love of country, right? There's something missing from that form of excellence. At the same time, if you have some other part of excellence, but you aren't willing to, either you're unwilling to, fight for the love of country or give up your private interest, or you're not even able to respect someone that does, that's also something missing. But I was wondering how, if we could come to some fuller, if we can try to articulate Frederick Douglass's fuller vision of human excellence.
Yeah, great. So, Douglass is, I think, criticizing and rejecting the kind of blind nationalism and patriotism. He is very attuned to the danger of blind nationalism, to my country, right or wrong type of blind faith in a kind of tribalism of crass nationalism. Douglas is a humanist, and there is a kind of Enlightenment ethos that fuels his philosophical stance. That is, there are values that he takes to be universal: freedom, human dignity, equality, that should override claims of national prerogatives, that should override nationalism, that should override self-interest. So it seems to me that he is pointing to a kind of citizenship, to a kind of commitment to values that are Enlightenment and universalist values that are in some sense transnational. So Douglas's conception of American citizenship is very interesting, and it comes up in the last part of the speech, where he proposes citizenship as a kind of interpretive act, as a kind of commitment to basic Enlightenment principles articulated in America's founding documents, and a commitment to their interpretation and refinement and enactment as the mark of citizenship. It's something that Lincoln is going to echo in his conception of citizenship, articulated many places, but probably most famously in the Gettysburg Address, where he talks about a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is a nation that is brought together by this abstract commitment to a universalist principles. A nation that is formed not by ties to blood, not ties to soil, not kinship, not by unity against an enemy, not by pursuit of the common well-being, but by pursuit of this abstract principle which anybody can adopt. So we get this vision of American citizenship as open. That is, on Douglas's and Lincoln's sketch of American citizenship, there is no person that can be excluded, who is willing to undertake a certain set of commitments. So it is gesturing to a kind of, what Randolph Bourne would call in the early 20th century a transnationalism. I think Douglas is gesturing towards a transnational cosmopolitan vision of citizenship that we are very far indeed from realizing, and which is not a straightforward, there isn't a straightforward way to enact, as there are claims of sovereignty and national sovereignty that are in tension with that notion of citizenship. Broader debate, of course.
Next on the queue is Emma Cohen-DeLara. Please unmute yourself.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, because this discussion so far is extremely interesting. And just to give you a little bit of the context, is that I work in Amsterdam, in Europe, of course, and the Black Lives Matter movement that obviously exploded in June is currently having a huge impact on our college, which we're still looking for a way to relate to that. And in that context, I was really struck by the text, and in particular, the first question related to this, in particular to Douglas's relationship to the tradition, that he does not look for a black and white rejection of the American founding tradition that at least I think certainly rhetorically, but in some way, I think also heartfelt, feels a part of this glorious patriotism that he mentions. And so that struck me, because the movement today seems to have a very different approach to the tradition. And basically what I wanted to ask, and this maybe not a question for right now, but at some point this will come up, is how do you deal in America, if at your colleges or universities you're also dealing with a more or less activist, well, I'm going to use the word attack on a more classical curriculum, where the voice of reason is often very difficult to maintain. How do you deal with that? And you don't have to elaborate too long because it's more, we should talk about the text, but given my situation right now, it's something of somewhat urgency for me. So
yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think it's one aspect that is often overlooked about the task of liberal education. The task of liberal education very much involves the teaching and cultivation in this art of nuanced thinking. That is, those issues that students raise, and it's often students that they raise about the curriculum, about the institution, about the broader culture, are not extraneous. They're not side issues. They're not distractions from the work that we do, but are in fact central. And sometimes I think of a liberal arts curriculum, something like the Core at Columbia or your own liberal arts curriculum in Amsterdam, Emma, as a kind of lightning rod. And you know, a lightning rod is it's a intentional metal rod that is put on the side of the house to draw down lightning onto the house. That is, there's an electrical storm, the lightning will be drawn into the rod that's next to the house, usually in the roof of the house, extending down into the floor, and absorbs the discharge. And I think a general education program, it's like this in that it attracts to itself the fervor, the passion, the sometimes uncontrollable and potentially lethal discharges of energy, passion, politics, ideology. But in doing that, it keeps the house safe. That is, it becomes the place in which to metabolize the quest for justice, the thirst for fairness that is so prevalent and so alive in our young students. I always, you know, as director of the Columbia Core for 10 years, Columbia has a reputation for student activism, for radical student activism. So it was a constant part of my task to engage the radicalism of students, to bring into the conversation about the shape of the curriculum, their concerns, and it was enormously helpful for me to keep in mind that the thing that animates even the radical and sometimes illiberal position that this kind of fervor and conviction of I am right and moral fire, that what animates that is a sense of justice, is a sense of fairness, that what the students are asking for is a better instantiation of values that we in fact share. And if our current curriculum and our current approach is our best effort to instantiate those values, we should be able to engage and defend that instantiation and change it whenever it doesn't measure up to an emerging understanding or an emerging enlightenment. So it seems to me that part of our job is to engage this. So, you know, if students think that America is entirely racist, that America is about racism, that there are no redeeming qualities, well, let's look at the basis for such a position. Let's look at the history. Let's look at the texts. Let's read Jefferson. Let's read not only the beautiful Declaration of Independence, let's read Notes on the State of Virginia and try to examine his racism. But then let's look at at Lincoln and what Lincoln says about the Declaration of Independence and about Jefferson. Let's look at what Douglass says about the Founding Fathers. So in other words, our task of education involves encountering this raw, sometimes angry, sometimes narrow-minded fervor of young people. And today, the question of race is at the forefront, but not so long ago, the question of sexual violence on campus was occupying us, at least in America, and the pervasiveness of sexual violence and rape on campus. At various points, the militarism, or at various points, the exploitative economic system in which we live. At various points, some of these issues take center stage. And I think in each case, it is our job to face them directly, engage the students. And it's not easy, and it's not, doesn't always produce happy consensus. But it is very much why programs in liberal education and general education that deal with fundamental texts and fundamental questions need to be central. It is part of the critical, indispensable role that they play in a college environment. So I know that I speak in generalities, perhaps necessarily, but bottom line is that these courses and these texts give us an occasion to grapple, complicate, and in some sense moderate some of as part of the education we deliver, some of the raw energy that animates the more radical voices in our campuses, which often come from students. Sorry to go on and on.
No, such an important topic. But Joe Knippenberg, unmute yourself. You're next.
Okay, I have a two-part question. The first part is very practical, which is if you had to put Douglas's speech in dialogue with a couple of other texts, either from his time or contemporary texts, which would you choose and why? And then the second part, utterly unrelated, or maybe not, I'm learning a lot this week. It's the week of Constitution Day, and our Constitution Day lecturer reminded us that John Brown and Frederick Douglass were close acquaintances and allies. No one would ever describe John Brown as a principled pragmatist. So,
principled, yes.
Absolutely, but pragmatic, no. So I think that for me, the question is, how does Douglas's pragmatism cohere with his strategic alliance with John Brown, and where's the pragmatism there, or what's the pragmatic balance for Douglas in his acquaintance and alliance with Brown? Great
questions. First, as far as pairing Douglas, many pairings occurred to me, including Jefferson. Jefferson Notes in the State of Virginia, where Jefferson talks about race relations and Jefferson's incapacity to imagine a multiracial America. Jefferson, of course, was a slave owner, but recognized the injustice of slavery, and at various points in his political life makes attempts at putting in place schemes for abolition, but he can't imagine the freed slaves staying in America, or at least mixing with the whites. He thinks that he can't imagine a multiracial nation. Douglas is struggling to imagine that and insisting that is the only way forward. So that's a pairing that could work. I've already mentioned Lincoln. In the spring, I'm teaching a seminar on Douglas and Lincoln, where I'm going to do this explicitly, which is to put these two thinkers together. There are many points in which their responses to national events are extraordinarily rich ground for comparison and inquiry. For example, they each gave speeches in response to the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The Dred Scott decision says that the phrase in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equally, excluded blacks. That phrase means all white men are created equal, and that blacks do not have and cannot have the status of citizens in the American National Compact, American National Compact excludes blacks by definition. That's what the decision says. Douglas and Lincoln both make speeches in response to that, and putting them together, it's just extraordinarily productive. Other texts that you compare Douglas with are contemporary texts. Productively, I think, are Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, in which Coates meditates on the continuing legacy of racism in America and how it has shaped his experience and how it shapes the way he thinks about his young son and what he says to he feels he has to say to his young son. It can also be productively paired with the 1619 Project, which tries to it's a revisionist attempt to oppose the triumphalist narrative by offering a narrative of American with slavery at the center and with 1619 as the key American date rather than 1776. On the question of pragmatism and John Brown, I think Douglas's relationship to Brown is a great example of Douglas's pragmatism, because Douglas does not disagree with Brown on principle, including the use of violence. Douglas is ready to take up arms against the slave power and accepts and is willing to perpetrate violence, including lethal violence, to free the slave. If a slave insurrection could be organized that would decimate the slave owners and free the slave, Douglas would be on board. And that's what Brown is trying to do. But Brown's scheme, Douglas thinks, is not going to work. Douglas meets with Brown a few days before the raid in a dark, in the middle of the night in a barn, and Brown is trying to recruit him to join him in the assault that he's preparing. He's near Harper's Ferry, and Douglas says, "Look, man, I can." And Douglas raised money for him to help him organize the raid. But at the last minute, Douglas says, "Look, I don't think this is going to work. This is ill-advised. I agree with the legitimacy of the use of force and violence in the course of the slave. What you are proposing here is actually a suicide mission. It's not going to work. I'm sorry, I can't join you." And the moment that the thing goes down exactly as Douglas predicts, and John Brown is captured, Douglas flees the country. Douglas heads off to Canada because he is a wanted man because of his material help. He and a couple of others, Gerrit Smith also in Rochester, and a couple of people in the Boston area that supported John Brown, the so-called Secret Six, become targets of the law. But anyway, it's an example of Douglas's pragmatism there, that he does not join the violent uprising that Brown is trying to spark, not because he has any qualms about the legitimacy of violence and lethal violence in the course of the slave, but because he thinks it is pragmatically ill-advised.
Madison, I'm confident we're going to get to you, but I'm going to skip you on the queue for a moment and get to Casey Montás, who has not had a chance to ask a question yet. So please unmute yourself.
Thank you, and thank you for having these conversations. To Roosevelt, hi, brother.
Hi, brother. That last name, that's brotherhood.
So when I saw the previous video when you were introducing the text, you spoke about how Douglas came to realize that the recipe or the key to freedom was education, as he got that transmitted from the words of his master, telling the wife not to teach a slave to read. And then that brought me back to the first text that I encountered early in my reading years, many months ago. I don't remember if high school or early college, when I read Frederick Douglass, and he spoke of the fact that once he learned to read, at some point he hated himself for knowing how to read, because then he actually came to realize how bad his actual life was in comparison to the rest of the world. So if you could speak a little bit about this idea of education, and in this case, liberal education, as the key or the recipe to freedom.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. Casey, I don't just want to make the public statement that I don't resent the fact that you got the looks in the family. So if you remember the Douglas quoting his master, Hugh Auld, says, if you teach the slave to read, it will unfit him to be a slave. It will make him miserable. It will do him no good, but only make his life worse. And Douglas comes to agree with that too. Douglas, his awareness makes him miserable, makes his life conditions under slavery absolutely intolerable. And Douglas, it's almost a miracle that Douglas survives. That is, Douglas attempted escape and was caught. And if he had succeeded in the plan that he had to escape, that is, if the plan hadn't been, there was a snitch, so that it was a small group of them that were going to do it together, and one of them spilled the beans, so the plan was broken up. If they had actually succeeded in what they were trying to do, it was a kind of harebrained plan that probably was not going to work. Douglas also, at one point, because of his indomitability, his rebelliousness, was sent to a slave breaker. That was a master who specialized in breaking down rebellious slaves. That is, through violence, brutal deprivation, lack of food, hard work, constant physical punishment, and since Douglas goes to the slave breaker Covey, and Covey breaks him. Douglas says that he kind of reverted to a kind of animalism. He was like a beast. He really lost his will to freedom, but not entirely, because there comes a point in which then Douglas stands up to Covey and actually fights him. Covey is trying to whip him, and Douglas fights back, and he could have gotten killed. And he doesn't get killed. In fact, it changes his relationship to Covey. Is the last time that Covey tries to beat him. So indeed, this awakening that Douglas has does unfit him to be a slave. And it is, like Covey, like Hugh Auld said, dangerous for the slave to learn to read. I'm reminded of a passage in Kant, in the Metaphysics of Morals, where Kant talks about misology, that is the hatred of reason, because it often happens that the development of your reason, your education, complicates happiness, makes happiness more elusive, makes happiness harder to attain. So that some people might come to hate their development. And the funny thing about it is that, as Kant also implies, that even if learning complicates the possibilities for happiness, nobody, once they have attained the learning, is willing to give it up. That is, ignorance is bliss, but nobody chooses ignorance. So, it makes me think about today. That the kind of liberatory education that we offer can cause a kind of social ruptures. And I see it in my students often. Sometimes students come from very traditional backgrounds, religious backgrounds, or strongly patriarchal society, traditional societies. And the education they receive causes a rift between them and their communities. That is a real cost that liberatory education can have, and it's a cost that the people who most benefit from it are most at risk of suffering. And it's something that we don't often talk about. I mean, I think we like to think that liberal education is simply going to mean a richer life, a deeper life, a more engaged life, and all that is true. But I think we need to be honest that there is often a social cost to the kind of awakening that we are encouraging. And there's sometimes a political cost. I think this kind of education often encourages a critical, sometimes even adversarial relationship to the politics of your community. There is and this gets us into a very broad topic, but in my view, there is an inherent tension between democracy and liberal education. That is the rule of the many, the opinion of the majority, the consensus of the community. Liberal education trains you to be skeptical of the consensus. Liberal education trains you to ask hard questions and to challenge the consensus. And that is an uncomfortable position. That is the position that got Socrates killed. That's a position that got even Jesus killed, I think. Yeah, those are some of my thoughts on this question.
Addison, you get the last question. Please unmute yourself.
So I actually didn't have a question. I just had a response to his initial answer to my first question.
Great.
But I just thought it was really, really interesting how you mentioned that he purchased his own freedom and considered himself a principled pragmatist. I listened to lots of different speakers on these issues, and one of the most interesting things that I've learned within the last couple of months was that the reason the UK was actually able to avoid a civil war when they dismantled slavery was that they chose to financially recompensate slave owners after freeing their slaves. And they did so because whether you liked it or not, slavery was legal at the time. And so when they changed the law, it was in some sense a financial loss for slave owners. So I just thought it was an interesting thing that you would mention, a principled pragmatist, because that's really what it brought to mind for me, was the situation in the UK where, I mean, in our minds, this is a really terrible thing, but in another way, if we had done the same in the US, perhaps it could have saved a lot of lives and a lot of heartbreak, and also simultaneously done away with an evil system.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention that.
Great. One thing that I have seen in teaching American abolition is two really, really important insights that often come as surprises to students. One is that most abolitionists in the 19th century were racist. That is, it's one thing to be against slavery, that is to recognize the injustice and violation of basic human rights that slavery entailed. That's one thing. It's an entirely other thing to think that blacks are equal and that they deserve equal political rights as whites. So the vast majority of abolitionists who wanted to end slavery did not want civil equality, did not believe in equality of the races. So those are two quite different positions, being abolitionist and being anti-racist. And that comes as a surprise. I think many students just assume that if you were an abolitionist, you were racially enlightened. The other thing that I've seen in teaching abolition is that the abolitionist sentiment eventually becomes a dominant sentiment in the American population, and that's why Lincoln wins the election. Lincoln wins the election in a qualified abolitionist position that says, I'm against slavery, but I'm not going to try to end it as president because I don't have that power, but
Let's hold on, see if we can bring him back to finish his thought.
will prevent its expansion. On expansion, it will wither away and gradually disappear. Sorry about that. Let's. Okay, I think I'm back.
You're back.
Yeah.
You're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. the abolitionist sentiment became eventually the dominant sentiment. But what you do after abolition, that is, eventually most people came to think slavery should end. How should it end? What do we do with the free slaves? How do we deal with the slavery was the largest single asset class in the American economy. Imagine today if we decided that we were going to liberate the stocks, so that all holdings in stocks, retirement funds, and investment, we're going to liberate them all. It was something like that to end slavery. It would have been catastrophic for the U.S. economy as it existed. So how do you deal with that? Do you do a scheme of compensation as it did in Britain? Do you do gradual emancipation so that you set like a date, and beyond that date, people that are born are going to be free? Do you set a thing where when you reach 30 years old, you're free? Like, how do you do it? There was no agreement. And in fact, it seemed impossible to reach any agreement on that question. And what Lincoln ends up, the issue was forced. Like, there was a catastrophic civil war, and only under those conditions already the economy is destroyed. Already there is untold violence and death and destruction. Only under those conditions could the actual abolition of slavery take place here. So anyway, sorry about the.
Oh, it's okay. I'm afraid that is that's the end of our time. This is where I would encourage all of you to join me and clapping your hands and giving Professor Montás a big round of applause. We can't really do that. I guess we can do sort of the little hand thing if anybody wants to do that. But thank you, whether we can surround you with applause or not. Thank you, Roosevelt, for that wonderful
Thank you all. This
hour.
is really my pleasure.
And everybody, please join us again for our next core conversation. The video is already up, but Josh Perrins will be with us here October 16th at 10 a.m. Thank you so much for coming. Send me an email. Let me know what you thought of what we did. We're still tweaking our format. Thanks again to Professor Montás for being our inaugural core conversation scholar, and we hope to see you all again next month. Take care.